For the last several weeks, we've been looking at the teachings of Jesus called out of Matthew 5 through 7. What's that called? Last 3 weeks, actually. We did Matthew 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. What's that called? Sermon on the Mount. There you go. And can anybody remember what Jesus' main point was, if you will, as he was speaking? There's a lot of things he said in there, but maybe kind of sum it up into one thought. Anybody got an idea what he was saying in the Sermon on the Mount? There's more than that. He was giving that warning, wasn't he? Challenging people to get their heart right with the Lord. He was redirecting people back to an original intent of God's law, and thus coming under the guilty standard of the law, right? The standard that makes you feel guilty, that nobody could ever really please God, and then going to what Bill was saying, pointing people to the need for salvation. And so today we're going to pick up today's lesson. We're going to look at some accounts in the second year of Jesus' life, and specifically we're going to look at a few accounts that deal with his power over death. His power over death, because he does demonstrate that on multiple occasions, that he's not just got power over the demonic world, he's not just got power over disease, he's got power over death itself. And we'll see that this morning. So I'm going to need some, be ready, turn to Luke chapter number 7. Luke chapter number 7. I'm going to look at a few different things here in Luke, and there'll be some other places, but in Luke 7 here we're going to look at his power over death. And I need some readers who can read. We're going to do verses 1 to 10, so I need a 1 to 5 and 6 to 10. 1 to 5, 6 to 10. Read really loud. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Now when he had ended all his sayings in the audience of the people, he entered into Capernaum. And a certain centurion's servant, who was dear unto him, was sick and ready to die. And when he heard of Jesus, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him that he would come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they besought him instantly, saying, that he who is worthy, for whom he should do
This.
For he beloved our nation, and hath built us a synagogue.
Okay, 6 through 10. Centurion. Neither thought I myself. Okay, so does anybody know what a centurion is? Hopefully some of you do. What's a centurion? No? More? A leader over 100. We get the word cent, which century, which means 100 years. It's one who's a commander over 100 soldiers. Okay, so this guy is sending a message to Jesus. And it's an interesting note here that this centurion, he's speaking through speaking to Jesus, and he's speaking with this kind of a begging that Jesus will do something for him. Now, what is the attitude of the Jews to the Romans at this time? They hate him, and I would say the Romans are probably the same toward the Jews. They don't like the Jews anymore because the Jews don't like them, and Jews make it very difficult to be lords over them. And so you have this guy who's a leader over Roman military people begging a Jewish Messiah to help him in his time of desperation. Now, there is something neat about that attitude that he's got, that he's obviously realizing that Jesus is not just for the Jews, that Jesus also cares for those people as well. That wasn't the mindset, I think, of many Jews. The Jews felt that the Messiah was only to be for the Jews and have nothing to do with the Gentile world, but that's not what we see here. Now, there's a parallel passage. I want to see if you can see what appears to be, I want to say it on the surface because it looks like it on the surface, but it's not. It's real easy to see here why it's not. It appears to be a contradiction. But Matthew chapter 8, verse 5 through 13. I want to see if someone can read it. Now, just understand here, chapter 7 of Luke says that he has sent a messenger, the centurion did, to come and talk to Jesus. Matthew chapter 8 does something a little different, says something different. If somebody wants to read that out loud, Matthew 8, 5 through 13, and see if you can see why it looks, what's different about what he says here as opposed to what is said in the Luke 7 passage. Do you have that, darling? All right, Matthew chapter 8, verse number 5 through 13. Okay, so what's the difference, the major difference we see from this? I'm not asking about the conversation. There's nothing really too different about the conversation that Jesus has with this man and Jesus, obviously. That's nothing different there, but there's a major difference happening in the account. Did you see it? Luke 7 says something, and Luke in Matthew 8 says something a little more different. No, not the conversation. No, I mean they both can be the same, mean the same. Yes, one is the centurion himself, and the other one is the messenger of the centurion speaking to Jesus. So how do you deal with that? Where you got one that has the centurion sending his servant, that's Luke 7, and the other one is the centurion coming to Jesus. How do you deal with those, what we'd call an apparent contradiction? There are things like that in the Bible, so you got to be able to answer those when those get brought up. How do you look at that one? Yeah. It says the centurion came. Matthew chapter 8 is speaking in a, well, I'm not going to give the answer yet. Let's see if you can figure it out. Anybody got an idea? Got to think a little bit here. You got to think how people wrote. Okay, yes. Well, you have the servant speaking on behalf of the centurion? I think the answer is in that answer that I just gave her. When the centurion is speaking, he's speaking through the servant. So in Matthew, he just condenses that and doesn't even give that detail that it's a servant being sent. He's just giving it from the message from the centurion to Jesus. And it's not saying that the centurion is there specifically speaking, but you get the idea that the centurion is being represented to that man, to Jesus, if you will, through that servant. Does that make sense? I don't know that you're convinced. Okay. So Matthew 8 condenses details. It doesn't give you the details of the fact there's a servant that showed up and is speaking to Jesus. It just says the centurion came and spoke to Jesus. But then you got Luke 7 that tells us that the centurion sent his servant to speak to Jesus. What's actually happening here is that Luke gives you the details. Matthew just gives the message, if you will, of the centurion. Okay? And so we got to remember that when we see things that look like that, it usually oftentimes the Gospels are filling in details that are missing in other places. Okay? Does that make sense? It's similar to what I've said before when we've looked at the four Gospels. And by the way, the Gospels are not the only thing that do that in the Bible. When you look at 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Samuel, there are in those passages that have parallel things that are being said. They're being said the same way, or being said about the same thing differently. They're usually, oftentimes, they appear on the surface a bit contradictory, but when you start connecting the dots, you realize what they're doing is filling in gaps that are not being given in other places. Okay? And so that's what you have happening here, where you have Luke is filling in gaps of what Matthew actually doesn't say. Does that make sense? Okay? So instead of seeing it as the Bible's full of contradictions, just see it as God is completing the full picture. Okay? All right. Long answer for a short question. Okay. So here, the centurion, he says something here to Jesus. It gives an illustration to Jesus about authority. What does he say? Did you catch what he's saying in this passage about authority? Yeah, obviously he does. He knows what it means to be over people, to command that things be done, and he expects they're going to get done, right? I mean, you got 100 soldiers. You give a command to some guy that's under you, you're not going to sit around questioning whether that's getting done or not. If it doesn't get done, the person under you that didn't do it's going to be in big trouble. This guy, he says, I understand what it means to give commands and expect that things be done, right? How does that connect to what he's saying about Jesus here? He knows that Jesus has authority the same way, to be able to command and expect that things be done. And so what is he telling, what is he saying that he knows Jesus can do here for his servant, or for his, his servant that's sick, that's dying? He knows that he doesn't have to have him come to his house and touch him and do anything. All he has to do is command, and it will be done. And that's exactly what Jesus is amazed at, because he says here, he marvels at the man, saying, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. Isn't that a bit of an interesting statement that he makes? He says, the very people that I have been sent to, I haven't shown this kind of faith. But the people that are traditionally the enemies of my people have greater faith than this man does, or than the Israelites have. And in fact, when you see a little bit later, if you look back at that Matthew 18 passage, or Matthew 8, passage, where Jesus goes on to say some more things that Luke doesn't put in here. He talks about that the children of the kingdom are going to be cast out of the kingdom, while those who are from the east and the west, he's talking about Gentiles, people from other parts of the world, are going to be brought in. He makes the point that the Jews who the Messiah was sent to don't even demonstrate faith enough to be saved. They're going to be the ones that are out, and the people that were not, that the Messiah, if you will say it this way, was not first sent to, are going to be the people that come in. Isn't that an interesting thought? That doesn't mean that the Messiah didn't come to them. He came to the Jew first, though, right? And it says, I think it says in the scripture, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. For the most part, the Jewish people had nothing to do with him. So this is an interesting statement that we have going on. Now, what happens? What happens? Yeah, Jesus speaks, and just as the centurion expected would happen, it happens. He spoke, and the command was followed through. And by the way, Jesus didn't have any fallen soldiers or corrupt, fallen, ungodly people that he had to command to make do stuff. He's perfect in every way, and however all that works in the heavenly spiritual realm, he didn't have to worry about whether somebody's going to fail in doing what he said, right? Whether he had anybody he had to do that with. Maybe it was just him only. But you get the point here. He's a man who has authority, and all of those things under him, he has authority over, and they obey. Yep. Yeah. Well, you do see that in the Gospels, that there are people coming from outside of Israel, coming because they're hearing of what Jesus is doing and coming to him. And by the way, this isn't the only centurion that Jesus reaches. We see that, you remember the centurion at the cross? The one that's standing there that's in charge of the execution of Jesus? The one that's there that had to make sure he gets put to death, nailed on a cross, is standing there at the cross saying, surely this man is the Son of God. This isn't just any ordinary man here we're looking at. So this man had great trust and Jesus demonstrated his great authority to heal this servant who was about to die. All right, let's keep reading. Go back to Luke 7 again. Look at verse 11 through 17. 11 through 17. If I can get some readers again, let's do 11 to 14, okay, and then I'll get you to do 15 to 17. Okay? Yep. Okay. Okay, so here is a different situation. You have the one we just read was a man who's coming to seek Jesus to do something on his behalf. Here is completely the opposite. Jesus happens to walk into this little town called Nain. And when he comes into the town, it's not a happy town. Not at this point. Why? Because there's a funeral going on at this moment. Just give you a little bit of background about how they did funerals. They don't do them like they didn't do them like we do. When we do funerals, they put those things in the body that preserves the body, and all that kind of stuff happens, and those people that do the nasty stuff, the undertakers and all of that, they take care of that part, and the body can sit there unburied for days, without any trouble. Whenever somebody died, it was usually instantaneous. They had a funeral. Death happens the same day they're having a funeral. And they're calling out, and usually there were these people that were assigned to be mourners. They were just kind of expected that when funerals happened, there would be people that would be crying and singing songs of sorrow and all that as the funeral procession is going on. And it's probably not the case where they would be able to bury somebody in a tomb, because usually that was only for rich people. You remember where Jesus was buried, he was buried in a rich man's tomb. Most likely they were buried like we would talk about burying somebody, just digging a hole and putting them in the ground. And it tells us here that there's this situation here, that this is a child that has died, or not a child, but a young man that has died. Some people have suggested that the Greek word there for young man or for man is most likely somebody who is under the age of 40. I can't be dogmatic about that, but he's apparently has no relations in any way except for the fact he's the only child of, or only son of, this woman. What's the problem with that? Especially for the woman right now. Nobody to take care of her. Nobody to take care of her. In that kind of a patriarchal society, it was very hard for a woman to survive on her own. She needed the help of a husband, and if her husband is dead, the help of a son. And we've seen examples of that several times in the scriptures. You can go back to the book of Ruth, where you see that example played out and why that was troublesome. To Naomi, who lost her husband, and to Ruth, who lost her husband. We see obviously that Jesus was the one taking care of his mother when Joseph is no longer on the scene. And as he's hanging on the cross, do you remember what he does with John, who's standing there at the cross next to Mary? He says, woman, as he's talking to his mother, behold your son. And he wasn't talking about himself, he was talking about John. And then he looked at John and he says, John, behold your mother. In other words, you're now going to be the one responsible for caring for her, because I'm not able to do that anymore. That was the way things worked in that kind of a society. And when it came down to someone being a widow, you even see the New Testament church picks up that role of caring for widows. We see it in the book of Acts, where we see the role of the widow being made prominent in a very specific issue, where the Jewish widows and we'd say the Hellenistic Jewish widows are clashing because of the fact that they feel like some are being cared for and some are not. We see in the book of 1 Timothy where Paul gives the church commands on how they're to take care of widows and which ones are, as he calls, widows indeed. Because not everybody that fits into the qualification of widow is necessarily a widow that's worthy to be cared for. From the church's perspective. So that was understood as something that goes on here. And so here, the widow of Nain here is burying the only one who can care for her. And Jesus happens to be walking into that very town at that point. And what does he do? The casket's passing by, and he reaches out and touches the casket. And what happens to that boy, that young man? He sits up. Well, that would have shocked everybody. Could you imagine being in that funeral, watching that funeral happen, and everybody's crying and tears are all down their face, and they're about ready to bury, they've already dug the hole, and they're about ready to bury this boy, and Jesus walks by and touches him, and he sits up. Yeah, hysteria there, right? But Jesus, it tells us the reason why he did it is because he had compassion. Compassion on who? Who do you think he's got the most compassion on at this point? The widow. He cares for her in her situation. He cares for her in the situation that she is in. And it tells us here that, in fact, I'd say it this way, it doesn't tell us. You don't see anything talked about here at this point about the woman's faith at all, or anybody in the crowd's faith, or the disciples' faith. There's nobody asking Jesus to do anything. It's just simply Jesus acting and demonstrating his compassion toward this person in a dire situation. All right, now we come to another one. Let's go to Luke chapter number 8. So move over. Luke chapter number 8. And I'm going to need verses 40 through 56. 40 through 56. And let's see if I can get 40 to 45. Let's get some new readers here that haven't read yet. 40 to 45, got Caleb. 46 to 50. 46 to 50, Miss Melissa. And 51, I'll just give you the longer one, 51 to 56. Who does this one? Anybody want to? All right. Well, hold on. You already read. Come on, somebody. Get some courageous people to read here. Anybody courageous? All right. 51 to 56. Start us off. Who was it that I had originally? Oh, yeah, Caleb. Go ahead. Stanched. Yeah, you have 50. It's 51 to 56 for him. Okay. Okay. So at this point, we see again Jesus demonstrating his power over death. Now it tells us here back at verse 40 that there's this crowd. See that? It says, it came to pass that when Jesus was returned, the people gladly received him, for they were all waiting for him. Why were they waiting for him? Well, good indication is found in verse 39 to tell you why they're waiting for him. It says that, look what it says, return to thine own house and show how great things God had done unto thee. And he went his way and published throughout all the whole city how great things Jesus had done in him. This is a reference to the man who was filled with devils that Jesus cast out. And he publishes this. Remember I told you a few weeks back, looking at the life of Jesus, that he actually had to start telling people, say nothing to anybody about what happened. Why? Not that Jesus doesn't want people to know about him, but because it was causing these kinds of situations that everywhere he went, he couldn't really do anything. I mean, he was kind of, it was like I told you when we went to that Donald Trump rally a few years ago or a couple years back, that it was so many people, you couldn't move anywhere. And that's the situation here that was going on. Everywhere he went, he was just constantly packed and constantly trying to find his way around. And so that's the situation that's going on here. And so they get there, and somebody immediately comes to Jesus. Who is this person? What's his name? Jairus. Who is he? What do we find him out to be? He's a ruler of the synagogue. He's a synagogue leader. He's a guy who's in charge of what goes on in the local synagogue there, which means obviously he's a a spiritual leader to some degree. Whether he's friendly to Jesus or not, we don't know, but he's obviously desperate at this point. What's the situation going on? His only daughter is dying. She's laying at the point of death. And his concern is that Jesus needs to get here and heal her before she dies. But again, you remember what's going on. There's this huge crowd of people, and Jesus, it says the people were thronging him, literally meaning they just shoulder to shoulder. There was just no way to get through quickly. You couldn't get through quickly at all, and he is just slowly moving his way through the crowd. And you can imagine the dad, he's like, Jairus is like, can you hurry up? Get over here before she dies. Anyone ever been in that point where you feel desperate and it just seems like as you are desperately waiting for something to happen, it's just going as slow as possible, right? By the way, is that out of God's plan here for Jesus to be slowed down? No. There's important things about to happen here. Okay? There's someone there in the crowd that happens to creep in the crowd. We find that she's a woman with an issue of blood. It's probably likely a feminine problem that she's been dealing with that she can't seem to stop. She continually bleeds and bleeds and bleeds. And it tells us that she's gone to doctor after doctor after doctor, and she is none the better. And she has spent all her money doing it. She's in that situation. What's the Bible have to say about somebody in that condition? There's something that the Bible says. They're unclean spiritually. And in that being unclean spiritually means they're not allowed to be among people. They're supposed to be like outcasts, almost like lepers to some degree. That's the situation that they are sitting at. What is she doing here? She's breaking that rule because she has her hopes that this guy can heal her. She doesn't even stop him. The reason why she doesn't stop him is because I think, one, it might be a bit of embarrassment just to bring it up in front of the entire crowd, but two, she's violating all these rules and she's doing it secretly, hoping nobody knows. And everybody who finds out that they've been shoulder to shoulder with her are going to be absolutely furious. And so what does she do? Sneaks in, and she get the idea, she's crawling. She's not standing in the crowd. She's crawling because it says she touches the bottom of his garment. The very side of his garment at the bottom as he passes by, just reaches out. And she has it in her mind, if I just reach out and touch, I'll be healed. I don't even have to ask. Now let me say, what kind of faith is that? Tremendous faith. She's putting herself in a place of great risk if she gets caught. And she's trusting that Jesus has such power that he doesn't even have to be asked. Think about that. Does Jesus have that kind of power? Obviously he does, because as he's walking through the crowd, all of a sudden he stops. Now, does he know who it was that did this to him? He knows everything about everything, okay? Let me just throw that one in here. When you see him asking questions about stuff, it's not because he needs answers. You go all the way back to the very Garden of Eden. You remember what God was saying in the Garden of Eden to Adam? Adam, Adam, where are you? Was it because God didn't know where Adam was? He knows exactly where Adam's at. The one who made trees, the one who made man, the one who made everything knows what's going on, right? He's hiding among the trees. God can see through the trees. The Bible says that nothing's hidden from his sight. Nothing's hidden from his sight. He sees in the light and in the darkness. It says, in fact, the darkness is like light unto him. But he's asking for the sake of getting this woman to speak up about what she just did. Why? Why do you think he wants her to do that? What'd you say, David? Yes, that's it. Jesus is not running at the speed of Jairus trying to get this thing dealt with for Jairus' sake. he takes his time to stop and use this woman as an object lesson about what kind of faith God wants us to have. To teach all the people that are standing around watching this whole thing, to teach all of them that Jesus wants this kind of faith directed toward him. And he tells the woman, your faith has made you whole. Your faith has made you whole. This is the kind of faith God expects us to have. What does faith look like? Faith trusts God when all other options are gone. Faith trusts God against odds, all the odds. Faith trusts God whenever it's difficult and dangerous to do it. That's what faith looks like. This is the kind of faith that he expects us to have. So he stops to just teach while this dad is getting upset. Well, exactly what the dad expected to happen happens. Jairus then sends messengers back to Jesus while he's still teaching that his daughter's dead. Don't trouble the master anymore. Don't trouble the master anymore. What's Jesus' answer to that message? What's his answer? Yeah, that's it. You think death stops me? You think death is the enemy, the one enemy I cannot defeat? And so he gets to the town. What's already going on? Already going on. It's what I told you about the widow of Nain. What's already going on? The funeral's already going on. The mourners are already out there crying, wailing. Wah! And Jesus is like, can you get those people to hush it? I'll say it, I could have said it the other way, but I'm saying it more politely. And he says, she's not dead, she's just sleeping. Sleeping. I'm just going to go in and wake her up. You know what he's doing here? He's using language, figurative language, to describe death, but the fact that death has not taken her. Death doesn't hold her. Remember, he did that with Lazarus at one point. You remember with Lazarus who had died, and he says he's not dead, he just sleeps. Or he tells that to his disciples, and they say, well, if he's sleeping, he's doing well. We don't need to go back to Bethany and risk our lives from the people who've already tried to stone you. But then he had to plainly say, yes, he's already dead. He's already dead. But what does it say the people did when he said that, made that statement? She's not dead, she's just sleeping. They mocked him, laughed him to scorn. So what does Jesus do with those mockers? Get them out of here now. Just send those people out of the house and close the door. Don't let them in here anymore. And then as he's in there, he takes that little girl and he raises her from the dead. Raises her from the dead. We see that Jesus has the power not only to heal the sick, but has power to raise the dead. Death is not an enemy that he cannot defeat. Right? And it's not just, as we're going to see, it's not just other people's death he can't defeat. It'll be his own that he has power over. He said, no man has power to take my life. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have power to take it up again. He's victorious over death. Give your activity here today. Let's look at this one. If I get TJ, if you'll take these and hand them around. And we're going to look at what's called victorious over death activity. Everybody got enough? I got enough here if you need to hand out any more.
No, I think that's it.
Okay. All right. All right. So we've seen how Jesus cures the incurable, how he's healed the dying, and even how he's raised the dead. And so we're going to spend some time looking at how Jesus conquered death and why he has the authority over death and how that is beneficial for you. How that's beneficial for you. So we're going to look at some passage here. So I need some people ready to look up passages and read them for me. You got them already listed out here. If I can get someone who'll do the number one passage, the Isaiah 58, 8 to 12. Who wants to do that one? Okay, Bill. Okay, I need someone who do the Psalm 16:10 passage. Wayne. Okay, someone, and this one's actually got two passages, so I might need a couple readers, or if you'll just be ready to turn to both. Acts 13:26 to 39, and Psalm 16:10. Is there somebody who wants to do that? Okay, Caleb, in the back. All right, and then for these here, let's just do these as we get to it, okay? We'll look at these, but just kind of be ready for that when we get to number 4, all right? All right, the Isaiah 53, it says, how does this messianic passage foreshadow Jesus' victory over death? So as you hear Bill read this passage, in fact, I would suggest that you look with him, even though you're not reading it out loud, look with him because you're going to be looking for little evidences of the resurrection that are in this verse, in this passage that he's talking about. See if you can find it when he's done reading. So go ahead, Bill, and read that for us. Iniquities. Okay, now some of this might be hard to understand what he said, but there are some hints in there that he is giving us that Jesus doesn't stay dead. Okay? He becomes the one that becomes the offering for sin for people. He is the one that dies, he's buried and all of that, but there's some hints that he doesn't stay dead by what is said in this passage. Did anybody catch any of those hints? Yes, he shall be prolonged. That's a reference to his resurrection from the dead. He is not going to stay dead. But his seed, God's seed, the Son, is going to have prolonged days after this. Okay? What else? Anybody else? Wayne, if you got one, you can keep going if you got more. There are some more in there. There's an implication here that he's still alive if he's doing that for people, right? Let's say it this way. He will bear their iniquities, but he will receive an inheritance with many. What do we know that Jesus ends up becoming? King of kings and Lord of lords, and he inherits all things. And we get to be co-heirs, if you will, joint heirs with him. The only way that can work is that he's still alive. He's still alive. Okay? It says he pours out his soul unto death, yet he presently makes intercession for the transgressors. How's that possible? He's alive. He doesn't stay dead. He conquers death. Right? And so you see this, even though it's not very, very, very clear, you do see little hints of the fact that even though he dies, he is going to live. He has power over death. That's a veiled one, but it's there. Okay? Psalm 16:10. Who had that one? That was Wayne. All right, go ahead and hold on. Let's everybody turn with him. Okay? I know that this is a little more work, but turn with him and read along so you can see and answer the questions as well. Okay? Psalm 16:10. Give a minute for everybody to find their place. There's only one verse, so it shouldn't be as hard to see. It's here. It talks about, again, Jesus' resurrection. Where do we see it? How do we see it? Okay? Psalm 16:10. Okay, who's written this psalm? Look back up at the very beginning of the psalm. It says, Miktam of David. Okay? David is obviously the writer here. He's the writer of the psalm. So David is saying that God is not going to leave his soul in hell. What does hell mean? Does it mean he's going to the place of judgment? No, it's a reference to the place of death. At least in this case, that's what that means. That's the context of this. But he says, but neither will thou suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. Who is the Holy One here? The Lord Jesus Christ. It's a reference to the Messiah. He says, I'm not going to stay in the grave, David is saying, but neither is the Holy One going to stay in the grave. He won't even see corruption. That's how little he's going to be in the grave. How long does it take for somebody who's not been processed through the morgue to see corruption? Just days, right? Days, and their body starts deteriorating and falling apart, especially in a Middle Eastern country where there's it's not cool, it's hot, barren, dry. That body's gonna start breaking down really, really quick. But here, there's a prophecy given that the Holy One will not see corruption. He will go to the place of death, but he will not come to the place of corruption. Why? Because he's going to raise from the dead. Raised from the dead. And by the way, the implication here is that David is saying the reason why I won't stay in the grave is because he is going to raise from the grave. Why is it that we all will escape death if you're saved? Because of Jesus' power over death. Okay? Now, that passage is now connected. You don't need to read the Psalm 16:10, but who had the Acts 13 passage? Was that you, Caleb? So everybody remember that? You got that passage? So we're going to look at the Acts 13 passage here. And this is, I believe, is Paul preaching. And we're going to see what he has to say in regards to the things that he actually quotes out of this psalm that we just read. So go ahead and read that for us, Caleb. Yep, you keep going. that through this man Okay, so let's see here. He actually quotes a couple different Psalms. You see one, he actually quotes Psalm 2, which Psalm 2, he says that thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. That seems hard to connect that to the resurrection, but he does connect it to the resurrection here. Why does he connect it to the resurrection? Well, yes, Jesus, the Psalm actually seems to be a reference to the Messiah being the incarnation of the Messiah. You actually see that in the book of Hebrews. It's used that way. But here, Paul, who's writing, actually connects that passage to the resurrection, in a sense, declaring him to be the Son of God with power because he rose from the dead. It's one thing to make the claim you are the Son of God. It's another thing to declare it with your own resurrection from the dead. Do you get that? And that's what he's saying here. But then he quotes again the psalm that we read there in the last one, Psalm 16:10, and he makes the connection that David's still in his grave. He's still dead. But there's one that didn't see corruption, and who is that? Jesus. Yeah. Jesus. All right. I don't know if I answered your question. How does this passage clarify or change your interpretation of Psalm 16:10? I don't know that you had a different interpretation, but there you go. All right, so let's look at this next part. And this one, just going to get some readers that'll read these. And what we're going to look for in these parts here are just little statements that are said that identify Jesus' power over death. Little statements that are given. So if I can get some readers who will read each one of those. John 11:25 and 26. Who wants to do that one? Okay, Darla. Acts 2:22 through 24. All right, we got you. Lucas. Romans 6:9 and 10. Got that for you. Hebrews 2:14. Andrea. Hebrews 10:12 to 14. Somebody who can read real good and loud. All right, Bill, back there in the back. All right. Let's go ahead, and I want you to try to figure out, listen to them, say it out loud for everybody real well, they can hear you, and see if we can find some of the statements that are given that identify Jesus' power over death. Okay, John 11:25. Go ahead. Okay, so what do we see? What are some major phrases there that speak of his power over death? I am the resurrection and the life, right? That's another one. And then he goes on, though he were dead, yet shall he live. That's an implication that he not only will raise from the dead, but he also will raise people from the dead. And then he says, and they shall never die. He has power to stop death in its tracks. You know, death is the enemy over us all. We are all subject to it. Do you realize that? Every one of us are subject to death. You cannot defeat it on your own. There's only one who's got the power over death. Jesus Christ. Okay? Acts 2:22 to 24. Determinate. Okay. All right, that's it. All right, so what do we see here? Some phrases that speak of his power over death. Huh? Did you see one? Okay, what's 24? Yeah, God has raised him, having loosed the pains of death. You get the idea? Loosed, like untied. Took death's straps and loosened them so they couldn't hold Jesus in that place. And then it says, and it's not possible that he should be holden of it. That's kind of weird way of saying it, but it's not possible that death can hold him and keep him dead. Why? Anybody got an answer for why that is? Well, he's the Son of God, but there's something even more important and more significant to that. Yeah, he has power over death, but why is it not possible that death can have a hold on him? It's one major important reason why. One very important reason. Because he's sinless. The wages of sin is death. And somebody submitted himself to death who had no sin. So in a sense, death has no right over him. It cannot hold him. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Next one, Romans 6, 9 and 10. Okay. So what's some phrases there that we saw that talks about his power over death? He dieth no more. Death hath no more dominion over him. It speaks of the fact that he submitted himself to death, but death won't ever take him again. He has power over death. In fact, in the book of Revelation, he says, I am he that liveth and was dead and am alive forevermore, and I've taken the keys of hell and of death. Nobody is going to put me under the power of death ever, because I hold the keys of death. All right? Hebrews 2:14. Who had that? Was that Andrea? Okay. All right, so what is it? How do we see the resurrection in that? That through death he might have power to destroy the devil who held death over people's heads. You know why you don't have to live with the fear of death if you're saved? Because he's already conquered it. He's already conquered it. The people who live in the fear of death are living, if they're saved and they're living in the fear of death, they're not living in the truth of that reality. And for those that are saved and apply it, they don't have to live under the burden and the fear of it. Why? Because he's already conquered it for them. And the implications of that doesn't mean that they will never die. It means that they won't have to face God in his wrath in death. Right? Okay. Hebrews 10:12. Hebrews 10:12 to 14. Okay, Bill, go ahead and read it for us. All right, so what do we find out here? Oh, yeah, 14, sorry. All right, sorry about that. I cut you off early. All right, so what do we learn here that shows his power over death? Did it say he rose from the dead in that passage? But he sits at the right hand of the throne of God. It says 2 times in there that he offered once. One sacrifice. And he has perfected all people with that one sacrifice, right? And it says, and he sits at the throne of God, putting all his enemies under his feet. And as we'll find in 1 Corinthians 15, which I'm not going to give you time to read this morning, but the last enemy he will put under his feet will be death. Death. So what do we learn here about Jesus' power? He has power not only over the demonic world, which we didn't really talk about too much today. He has power over disease, which we saw a couple different times. But he also has power over death. Power over death. And that is good news for those that are his. It's also hope for those who don't know him in a saving way, because if he has that kind of power, then he can save you. That's what his power is meant to do, is to save sinners from the bondage of sin, from the power of the devil over them, the fear of death. Deliver them completely in a safe way to God. That's his power. All right, let's go ahead and be dismissed in a word of prayer, and we'll come back about 15 after. If I can have, let's see, Brother Wayne, if you'll close us in prayer, and then you are dismissed.